My name is Jason Airy, and I serve as the director of the Historical Society. I hope you had one of those fabulous cakes or cookies. Can we thank all the volunteers for bringing in those treats? Tonight at Historic Cocky's Tavern, we have a talk. It's at 6:30. It's a free talk. It's part of our Carroll 250 speaker series. You know, the Historical Society has been designated by the county to take the lead on Carroll 250 semi-quincentennial activities over the next couple of years to 2026. And we have a speaker tonight, again at Cocky's, 6:30 to 7:30, Kate Fanning. She's from the community college. She's going to be speaking thunder in the pulpit. It should be a neat presentation. Please stop by. Parking will be on the street, on Main Street, as the Society's parking lot is currently closed because of the construction work. So maybe we'll see you tonight if you can get out. And then the holiday open house on the 30th, is it the 30th of November? We'd love to see you there. We've got a lot of neat plans in store for that event, so mark your calendars for the open house at the Historical Society. We would like to give a big round of applause to our two sponsors for today's BLT, Doris Hall and Dawn Thomas. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Larry. Career opportunities brought Larry Valett and his wife to Mount Airy 33 years ago, where they raised 3 children. Larry is retired from a career as a financial fraud examiner. In retirement, Larry and his wife have traveled extensively in the U.S. and around the world to feed their love for history. Larry has been involved with the Historical Society of Mount Airy for 10 years and serves as its vice president. He is the author of The Early History of Mount Airy, 200 Years on Pars Ridge, and there are copies back on that table that I'm sure that you can pick up. Kyle's holding one now. It is published by the Historical Society of Mount Airy and is now in its 2nd edition. Mr. Valett brought copies, as you can see, and I believe there will be a change box for purchases. Can we have a welcome for Larry at the podium here?
Well, thank you, Jason, for that suspiciously terse introduction. No, I appreciate it. I'm really privileged to be here to talk about my favorite subject, which is the town of Mount Airy. As Jason said, my wife and I moved here probably about 33 years ago, and we raised the kids. We're actually transplants from California. My dad's side of the family was from Iowa, but my mom was a Marylander. And on my father's side, my ancestors arrived from France, and interestingly enough, my 3rd great-grandfather, John Jacob Valett, arrived in the port of Baltimore in 1832, and he walked the Frederick-Baltimore Turnpike right past my backyard. So that was interesting development as I was working on the book. So enough about me. I thought with our time today I'd be mindful of the little time that we have and talk more about the book itself, kind of how it came together, and give you a sense a little how it's laid out. And then, of course, I can't really cover chapter and verse of all the contents of the book. You'll have to read it for yourself. It's available at fine bookstores everywhere. No, I'm just joking. It's available at the Mount Airy Historical Society. But it is also available at the Maryland Room, at the C. Burr Arts Frederick Library, and it's also available in Westminster Library and the Carroll County Library System, as well as Mount Airy Library as well. So the book really came about as we were thinking of several years ago of updating the Mount Airy Blue Book. For those of you not familiar, the Mount Airy Blue Book was a book, it's called Divisions of Home. It was written in 1994 by several of the town folks and the early members of what was to become the Historical Society of Mount Airy that was established in 1997. But the book was written in 1994, and it covers some of the early history of Mount Airy and various organizations, education, businesses, those sorts of things. And it had been probably close to 30 years, 25 years, when we started to think about updating that Blue Book. And in the interim, all of the work that the Historical Society had done since the 1990s was really pretty voluminous, I think we came to realize. There was many research reports and papers and history and land records research and blogs and all types of information that members of the Historical Society over the last 20 years collected really about the history of our town. And I think all of us, myself and Mike and Wayne and many of the other members, felt that, these tidbits of local history are available when you pick and choose them or locate them in a file cabinet, but we need a place to consolidate them. And so it really started out in 2019 when I volunteered to update perhaps the first few chapters of the Vision of Home, to do an update of that book. And I thought, I'll write a chapter or two on the early history of Mount Airy. And so I'm sitting at the computer and I have volumes of information, and it didn't take long to really realize, like, this is a book in itself. There's really so much information that we have. We could really cover a lot of history here. And so from there, it pretty much took off on its own. And it's fair to say that I am the author of the book and the orchestrator, but really the contributors to the book are many, many, many folks. Wayne Evans, who is here as a contributor, Mike Eco, our president, Doris, many, many members of the Historical Society, past and present, really wrote a vast volume of compositions and information that is compiled in the book that we finally had done. We also relied on many reference subject matter experts. I mean, we worked with the T. Hayes Watkins Research Library for the B&O, the Frederick Maryland Room and their team, the Baltimore Museum of Industry, where I have some contacts, and also at the Mount Airy Historical Society, we also were fortunate to have the entire collection of what was the old Community Reporter magazine that was established in 1929. And in that magazine, in that newspaper, there were many, many character sketches of a lot of these early people that lived in town. And this book really wouldn't be possible if it weren't for Pierce Ballas, who is the editor in Mount Airy of the early Community Reporter. So we had lots and lots of information to draw on, and it was basically that produced the book that we see today. So the book is about 250 pages. There's about 904 footnotes. One of the things we tried to do was to get away from this concept I think a lot of historical societies perhaps suffer from, which is town lore. A lot of old timers remember back in the day, or grandparents or great-grandparents, and that's great stuff, but it's harder to get some documentation and source material behind that. So to the extent that we could collect that information to bolster up these character profiles or the information that we contained in the book, we wanted to make sure that we referenced and cited each of those. We also have in the book early excerpts of the Sanborn fire maps. If you're not familiar, the Sanborn Company was a map maker in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century that mapped many, many American cities, including Mount Airy. And it was mainly to produce fire insurance maps, but it was also used by underwriters and bankers and engineers. And so in the back of the book are 4 beautifully colored fold-out maps that are excerpts that we were able to stitch together from the Sanborn maps, because the Sanborn maps are very huge and voluminous, but we could stitch together a portrait of Main Street as it looked in the 1800s and 1900s. So those are in the book as well for reference. And then the book is laid out essentially in 14 chapters. We cover 200 years on Parr's Ridge. It starts basically in the 1700s when John Parr discovered the ridge around 1740s. And then it covers the early roads and turnpikes. It covers the inclined plains. It certainly covers Mount Airy's close association and development with the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. It covers early pioneers on the ridge. And then from there, we launch into Mount Airy decade by decade, from the 1830s and 40s to the 50s to the Civil War years to the hard times of 1870s to the boomtown years of Mount Airy in the 1880s and business years in the 1890s. And then the tragic years really at the turn of the century in the 1900s, which I'll talk a little bit about today. And then it takes us up just prior to World War II. And it's interesting, people have asked, like, why this 200-year window? And I think it's fair to say, again, we had a lot of information in the Blue Book and other types of documents, and a lot of people that still live in town that remember Mount Airy as it was in their childhood, that remember Mount Airy around the war years, but really no historical memory of the early years of Mount Airy. And I find personally Mount Airy so fascinating because of its integral intersection with westward expansion and transportation. And I guess we could start on that. So I don't have the clicker, but we could go to the next slide if it's available. Great. So, I'll jump around just a little bit, but after the railroad came through what is downtown Mount Airy in 1839, Mount Airy really came to be a great grain depot, and mainly because it sat at the intersection of four counties, as everybody knows, Montgomery, Howard, Frederick, and Carroll County, just near the four-county line. And it was directly accessible right on the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. And not only that, the Baltimore-Frederick Turnpike, which was part and parcel of the National Road, was just right outside Mount Airy's doors. And in addition to that, there were other roads. The Monocacy-Annapolis Road, Old Annapolis Road that led from Monocacy Valley out to Annapolis, intersected Mount Airy. And then what everybody knows today as Main Street Mount Airy was also known as the Mount Airy Road, the Westminster Road, Ridge Road, but it was also known as the Buffalo Road that was built just before the Jackson administration to try to bring troops and transports ultimately up to the Canadian border to Buffalo, New York, and that was a problem that was recognized after the War of 1812. But that road didn't get very far. It cut through parts of Maryland and right through downtown Mount Airy, what is today Buffalo Road. But you could see that all these roads and transportations just kind of brought a whole host of villains and ruffians and characters to old Mount Airy. I guess if I were a movie director, I tend to think our town would make a great movie. I kind of see Kurt Russell in this cowboy role as the sheriff of the rough and tumble days of Mount Airy's railroad, but that's another story that we could talk about later. So I thought I would just read here and there a few excerpts of the book. This is from the introduction. And I say, there was one man who saw it all. His name was Somerset Dodson. He was born in 1854 as the son of Julia Dodson, a free African-American inhabitant in Mount Airy. She moved her family from Watersville to Mount Airy in 1858 and lived in a small log cabin along the south side of Cherry Orchard Road, now known as Prospect Road, near the old Anderson family home, where the Browncastle family now stands. By 1860, she had moved her family into another cabin along the Westminster Road, now known as South Main Street, and located across from Pine Grove Chapel. Their cabin sat in a small clearing in the woods and was the only structure on the western side of the Westminster Road between Ridgeville and Mount Airy. In his memoir, Somerset Dotson describes his life as a young boy during the Civil War, and he remembered the Union soldiers marching through town. As a youth, he worked in the home of Richard Van Sant, one of Mount Airy's earliest settlers, who served as a justice of the peace for the Woodville district in 1888. Somerset was later employed by Theodore Snyder to work on the National Road east of Ridgeville. When he grew older, Somerset married widow Mary Moles, later known in town as Aunt Mary, who had 6 children of her own. After his parents died, Somerset and Mary moved back into the old cabin on Westminster Road, and together they had 6 more children, including 2 sons, George Bill Dotson and Louis Dotson. Somerset later worked for Ernest B. Horn, a prominent landowner in town, and moved into a small house near Plainville Avenue, where he lived for 40 years. Behind his house, Somerset quarried the foundation stones for the Robert Garrett Sanatorium built in 1888. In his days, Somerset had seen the establishment of nearly every business in Mount Airy, except for Henry Buzzard's original tavern established around 1837. Somerset remembered that he carried Walter Rudy's satchel for him in 1887 when Rudy first arrived in town. He most likely witnessed 11 of the most significant fires along Main Street, including the fire of 1895, which destroyed the Mountain View Hotel located near his family cabin. Somerset lived during the bad times of Confederate raids in Mount Airy during the Civil War, shootouts at the train station, the lynching of Townsend Cook, the murders along Main Street, and the railroad riots and highway robberies along the Westminster Road. He most likely witnessed the good times too, such as the rapid growth and prosperity symbolic of small-town America, adventure and invention in the new age of transportation and booming industry. As an old man, he lived with his son Louis and was 85 years old at the time he was highlighted in the local Community Reporter newspaper on April 28th of 1939. And that's just an introduction that Somerset is one of many similar characters that are profiled and character sketched in this book. So next slide, if we can. So I apologize, you don't have to go back to the slide there that you saw. That was the Ridgeville toll house, and it was commonly believed for many years that it sat at the intersection of Westminster Road and Route 144, kind of where Anita's Liquors now sits. But according to the 1904 survey map that we found, it was actually about 1.3 miles down the road, closer to Sydney Road is today. And that was the half toll gate where a guy by the name of Fred Colbert collected tolls during his time in Mount Airy. And I think the round trip between there and Poplar Springs was like 12 cents. So moving forward to the next one. So the inclined planes. Mount Airy has a close connection to the B&O Railroad. And as everybody knows, Mount Airy sits on Parr's Ridge. Technically, it's called Parr Springs Ridge, discovered by John Parr in 1744. And Mount Airy is atop this ridge at its highest elevation. Parr's Ridge is a huge geological feature that arcs all the way across the state of Maryland from north of Baltimore to Middletown, and it slopes about a couple miles east, a couple miles west. And its highest elevation is about 1,000 feet high twice in Mount Airy, once by the cemetery at Pine Grove Chapel and another up by the firehouse. And the elevation at the train station in the center of town is about 830 feet. And in the early days of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, as many people here probably remember, the early concept was to create a railroad that horse-drawn wagons could pull freight on iron rails, because horses pulling those wagons on iron rails could pull 6 times the load than they normally could on a regular dirt road, because there's less friction. And that was the main concept when they started the B&O Railroad, to get between Baltimore and Ellicott Mills to service the Port of Baltimore and the great grain mills there in Ellicott City. And while that road was being built, the early days of steam transportation was being invented, particularly in England. There was nothing in America at the time. There was no railroad that existed for the purpose of carrying passengers or freight. There were a few tram railways in New England, but the B&O Railroad was just starting to experiment with some of these early engines. So nevertheless, the B&O had its vision to work their way out to Wheeling, West Virginia, because from there, people could take the Ohio River into the great Mississippi Valley and down to the Mississippi River and then settle in Clinton, Iowa, where my dad's family settled. And of course, all over the Mississippi. So that was the objective, to get from Baltimore to Wheeling, West Virginia, and thence to the Ohio River. But Pars Ridge was a real challenge. It was steep, and these early steam engines really didn't have enough horsepower. Your lawnmower today has more horsepower than these early engines did that looked like this. And when they hit the ridge in 1831, there was no Mount Airy at the time. That was all wilderness and farmland owned by many of the early settlers. They couldn't get these trains up and over the ridge, so they had to pull them up and over by horse team and mule team. And they did that just a mile down the road from Mount Airy on Main Street at what is known as the inclined plains, which were these long sloping earthen ramps that went basically a mile up the eastern slope and then down the western slope. So people would ride the train for Baltimore. They would get off at basically the area of Twin Ridge, Twin Arch in Plainsville. They would get on a horse wagon and take a wagon ride to the other side of the ridge, as horse teams and mule teams would pull the cars up and over the ridge and then back down to plane number 4, and passengers would get on and thence on their way to Frederick and beyond, Point of Rocks, and on to Wheeling, West Virginia. And that is how the railroad operated, actually, for about 8 years. And then they decided basically to, you could go to the next slide. They basically decided to look for a more easier path through the ridge. With the inclined planes, everybody is probably familiar with the Twin Arch in Mount Airy. That Twin Arch was built in the 1900s, and I'll touch base on that in a little bit. But this is the original Twin Arch from 1830 that was built to carry the inclined planes up the eastern slope and up and over the ridge. And it carried part of the stream on one side, and the turnpike went underneath the other side of the arch. This arch exists today. It's on private property. It's buried under bramble bush. A lot of us armchair historians sneak onto private property and snap pictures before getting kicked off. But we in Mount Airy have often talked with the mayor about ways to perhaps salvage and restore this piece of history, early B&O history, if not turn this early part of the inclined plains into its own trail. The next slide, please. So the founding of Mount Airy really comes not with the inclined plains. It comes when the B&O decided to cut through the ridge instead of going over the ridge. And they were looking for ways to lower the elevation. That is always, if you remember anything about American railroads, it's all about the grade. Flat and level is the best way to go. And so that's why they go through mountains or over trestles. So any chance they can to lower the grade, they'll take it. And this was the decision of the B&O Railroad in 1838. They decided to cut through the ridge. Now, Mount Airy at the time, it was all wilderness. Henry Buzzard was our town's founder. He was part of the Buzzard clan that lived on both the east and western sides of the ridge. Henry lived on a piece of property which was the family homestead established around the early 1790s. It was a location down by the Four County Pond near Griffith Road. It was a place called the Tan Yard. There was a tanning industry there, as well as the family cemetery and the early family home. And Henry and his brothers, Daniel Jr., over the years collected much of the property that now the town of Mount Airy resides upon. And at the time, the B&O decided to pay Henry Buzzard $250 for the right-of-way to cut through his property. And today it's a walking trail, but they actually started this work in the summer of 1838. The B&O contracted this work to a guy out of Baltimore named William Slater. And Slater hired 750 Irish immigrant laborers to cut this ridge by hand. This was the days before dynamite or nitroglycerin. They did have black powder, but they would have to drill into the rock by hand. They would pour the powder down there or tamp it down with cement or concrete and then light the fuse and run like hell to get out of there before being blown up. But the records do suggest that many people died on that ridge. The summer of 1838 apparently was deadly. It was unbearably hot. Many people died on the ridge due to accident and illness. And we actually believe many of these early workers were buried there in the ridge. You know, it doesn't make sense, particularly for immigrant labor, unconnected to church or family. They're not going to put them on a train back to Baltimore, certainly not pieces of them back to Baltimore if they blew up. And that is the way that the American railroads were paved west, with bodies that were buried along the transportation route. So that is how Mount Airy came to be. They finally successfully cut through the ridge in 1839. And Henry Buzzard threw an extra 4 acres with the hopes and promise that they would build a depot there in Mount Airy. In fact, in a lot of the records that B&O, many books written about the B&O, Henry Buzzard met with Benjamin Latrobe, the engineer, and he described his vision for Mount Airy, which at the time wasn't much. He wanted a house on a hill, which he eventually built around 1840s. He was hoping for a depot and a wagon yard and a tavern. And some of these things did come to pass. But finally, it was 1839 that the railroad came through. So next slide, please. So the Buzzard family were far from the only settlers on the ridge. There were many settlers. I just wanted to read a little excerpt here. When the railroad was completed, the tracks divided the old Westminster Road into North Main Street and South Main Street. It is along this road that Mount Airy was built upon the hills, steep slopes, and cliff sides owned by Henry Buzzard. But many other pioneering families here settled here long before or soon after Mount Airy was established. An examination of Henry Buzzard's stored ledger, which we have in our Historical Society from 1839, provides a rare glimpse of these early families and their first few customers in the early years. Names like Nimrod Harris, Thomas Fleming, Samuel Clary, Archibald Shipley, Gustavus Dorsey, Thomas Owings, Anthony Kimmel, Cornelius Grimes, Richard Brashear, and Samuel Todd reveal the early incursion of what were to become prominent families into the Mount Airy community. One such man was John Dietrich, a shoemaker from Germany who settled in 1835 and owned 18 acres along the turnpike. Dietrich's son, Philip J. Dietrich, would also become a shoemaker like his father as one of Mount Airy's first constables. So in addition to these, I think it's appropriate to point out there was another family. Everybody is very familiar with the Dorsey clan along the ridge and in Mount Airy. That side of the Dorsey clan came from the Edward Darcy Dorseys that arrived on the eastern shore, and then as I understand, the family kind of split off. And this side of the Dorsey clan settled all across the ridge. In fact, during the Civil War, there was one group of Confederates that had basically 16 different Dorseys, all related to each other from the ridge area. But just across from Henry Buzzard's tavern was an old 2-story log cabin that belonged to Gustavus Dorsey. And Gustavus Dorsey, we think, built that cabin in the 1830s. It was 2 stories. I believe it had 2 rooms. And it sits right now where Ben Goo's Antique Store is, if you've been to Mount Airy. And that store is Mount Airy's oldest surviving building that was actually built by William Hood in 1885. But prior to that, Gustavus Dorsey's cabin sat at that location just across the railroad tracks. And on the other side of the tracks where the caboose now stands in Mount Airy was Henry Buzzard's tavern. And that tavern shows up in the Carroll County tax records of 1837. And Gustavus Dorsey actually married Henry Buzzard's eldest daughter, Sophia. And Gustavus and Sophia had several children who later were to become prominent figures or characters in Mount Airy history. And then next slide, please. So I'd like to read an excerpt from here, some of the pioneers. So, 4 miles away from Mount Airy on the western side of the ridge and located along the Old Annapolis Road was the home of Major Daniel James. This home is still there. It's on a private farm. I was just on it about a month ago. The James house was a stone residence constructed by one of the early settlers in the area in the year 1763. A stone wall surrounded the front yard of the house. The property was once part of a vast estate known as the Nail of Benjamin, which was surveyed in 1670 for Benjamin Wells and others and encompassed 1,030 acres. Of this tract, 193 acres was owned by Thomas James that was granted in 1684 to his son, John James. In 1740, John James was appointed as the overseer of the Monocacy-Annapolis Road. During the American Revolutionary War, his grandson, Major Daniel James, pledged his oath of allegiance and served on the committee at the county level in support of freedom for the American colonies. Both General George Washington and General Lafayette reportedly visited the Daniel James house at various times. Major James married his wife Lucy, and they lived there together at the James house. And together they had a daughter, Sidney Ann James, who inherited the property. So to the left is the James house, and to the right is Major General Anthony Kimmel. And he has an interesting history. He's actually from Baltimore, born in Baltimore. As a boy, he fought in the War of 1812. He was in the Battle of North Point. But in 1822, he married Sidney Ann James. And together, they moved to the farm, and they built a place, a farm that they call Linganore, not Linganore Farm that everybody's familiar with. That's popular in Frederick County, I think. But another farm, Linganore, was a common name used, I guess, at the time, but just across the street from this home. And in fact, Kimmel is buried in Baltimore, but there is a memorial headstone, in fact, for Major Daniel James and for Anthony Kimmel on the farm property just outside of Mount Airy. And I don't need to go too much into Kimmel's history, but I'd just like to say Major General Kimmel walked the streets in downtown Mount Airy during his life here. In 1846, he established an account at Henry Buzzard's store on Main Street, where he purchased corn, butter, buckwheat, and various sundry items. Kimmel was an ambitious man. He was one of the electors of the Harrison-Tyler ticket when it was nominated, and in 1855, a few years after the death of his wife, he was made representative to France. He returned to the United States in 1857 and was elected to the Maryland Senate, serving in that position until 1861. He rose to the rank of a major general by commission from the Maryland Governor Thomas H. Hicks while he was in office from 1858 to 1862. Later in life, Kimmel was a member of the Association of Defenders and rarely missed an annual reunion, each recurring September 12th. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So I'll take a step back. There's a lot to say about the Mount Airy Mills. That could be a topic on its own. But I talked earlier about Mount Airy being a great grain depot. And many people, it's interesting when I talk to them, intuitively, I think a lot of Americans think of the early mills as being water wheel mills. That is, in fact, how most of these early mills in American history were built. But in the invention of steam, many, many mills became steam coal-generated power mills, which means that they could put these mills anywhere. And we did quite a bit of research on the mills in Mount Airy. I just wanted to cover a few things here. But this photo is brand new. In all things with the book, when we first produced the book in edition 1, it sold out like that in a matter of a month. And not only that, people came forward with new information and new photographs, so we did the second edition. And I have a few other photos in the second edition. This is not one of them. This one was given to us just a week ago by Ron Runkles. And Ron is related to a long history of the Runkles clan. I'm sure we probably have some Runkles here in this room. But this is a photograph of the early Dorsey Mill. That was one of the first mills established as early as 1808. It shows up on the Charles Vars map. Let me get my notes here before I get too far astray. Let me just read about this mill. Along the turnpike, Dorsey's Mill was the closest mill within the mile's walking distance from Mount Airy. Built as early as 1808, Dorsey's Mill and Bush Creek was both a sawmill and a grist mill identified on the Charles P. Varl map of 1808. It also appears on the Martinet map of Frederick County in 1858 and the Martinet map of Carroll County in 1862. The mill also appeared on the Isaac Bond 1860 map of Frederick County, and it still existed when it was included in the 1877 Frederick County Atlas. It is unknown when Dorsey sold it, but by the 1860 census, the mill belonged to Henry Wilson, who had one employee. The grindstones were driven by a water wheel, while by 1860, the sawmill was steam-powered. An inventory list recorded that the mill had 2 pairs of grindstones to grind flour and a separate 6-horsepower steam engine-driven sawmill. In 1860, the mill produced 400 barrels of flour and cut 20,000 board feet of lumber. Later, in 1880, the Census of Manufacturers reported that a 22-foot waterfall in Bush Creek drove an 8-horsepower wheel 3 feet broad at 20 rotations per minute. So, and many early residents of Mount Airy remembered the mill. Charles Buzzard was born in nearby Poplar Springs in 1869. He was the son of Henry's nephew, Randolph, and his wife, Marianne Kane Buzzard. Charles moved to Ridgeville at an early age, and in his memoirs, he recalled stating that this mill was located on the west end of Ridgeville at Mount Airy Junction, which was owned by a man named Watkins. The flour was stone ground using a water wheel that weighed several tons, and the siding was reeved out of shingles. Mr. Watkins sold the mill to Henry Wilson, who apparently is a great-grandfather of Ron Runkles. But then it was sold to another person in Montgomery County. And Charles Buzzard himself claims that he purchased this mill at some time in the late 1800s, but we don't know too much more about it. But what's interesting about this is this view, as best I could determine now, is taken from where the inclined planes, you see in the foreground a fence. And I think that fence line holds these sloping downward ramps of the inclined planes. Because in our research, particularly from the famous book, Molinography in Maryland by McGrain, he describes that in the early days, the inclined planes actually flowed over the water races that turned the wheel of this mill. And you can see just barely, not so in this photo, but to the right, behind the trees, just between the big mill and the little shed to the right, are the water races taking the water to the wheel. The water wheel is not visible in this picture. But anyway, this is the type of thing we all deal with in a historical society. We write a great book and then somebody gives us a photo afterwards. So it's not much we can do. Next slide, please. So, lo and behold, we came up with a couple things. For the longest time, myself, members of the Historical Society, really thought that the only two mills that existed in Mount Airy were the John B. Runkles Mill, the photograph on the right, that was built in 1890 by John Runkles, and then later, hold off, but it'll be in the next photo, but there was another mill just behind the train station. But lo and behold, in doing the research, we found that, in fact, one of the first mills on Main Street, built as early as 1880, was called the Mount Airy Mill property. And this was research help from the Maryland Room, and their team helped us identify this mill. But lo and behold, we came up with early accounts about the sale of this mill property. And Henry Buzzard owned the property that it sat. For those of you familiar with Mount Airy, this mill more or less sat right where the parking lot is to the upper deck, just on the other side of Hood Street, where the thrift store, if you're familiar with that parking lot. And in my personal opinion, I don't know that we have any evidence that there was a structure so much as simply a steam traction engine. And in part because of the description of the sale references the Mount Airy Mill property and all of the mill equipment that goes with a steam traction engine. But these traction engines were the early workhorses of American agriculture, and farmers could bring them anywhere to saw logs, to excavate, and to turn grindstones of mills. So it's possible that this traction engine was there on the lot of the Mount Airy Mill property. The mill didn't last very long. It was actually started by most probably Henry Buzzard. He bequeathed the property to his two sons, Frank and Byron, in 1880. They ran the mill for 3 years, and then they mortgaged the property to Robert and Elizabeth Selman. And Robert Selman was a delegate in Maryland. He was a real entrepreneur and a dairyman in Mount Airy. But they mortgaged the property to the Selmans, and they were unable to pay the loan back. And in 1886, there was a sale of the property that we have a description of that identifies this early mill. The mill to the right was the John B. Runkles Mill. John B. Runkles is another character, and I don't have a photograph of him, but again, we've been searching for photographs for John Runkles for years, and lo and behold, I found one just in the file cabinet 2 weeks ago. And so that's how it goes. But John Runkles was actually an early constable. He was born in the 1830s and 1850s. He was a constable for the Franklin District. I don't think he was very successful as a lawman because he went into the mercantile business and became a successful merchant in Mount Airy. And he built a big mansion just on the corner of Prospect Road and Main Street, where the empty parking lot is now. And in 1890, he built this mill. And he built this mill right on the site of what was Henry Buzzard's Tavern. I used to think, I don't know, I think Wayne and I and Mike have had discussions as to whether any of the remnants of this old building, you see the grain elevator to the right of that building, but the building itself is a general store called Runkles Brothers General Store. The photo at the time was taken when John Runkles' sons, Charles and Albert, were operating the mill and the general store. But nevertheless, we think that Henry Buzzard's tavern sat right there on that spot, and maybe part and parcel of that tavern still existed into this mill. The mill was destroyed by fire in the Great Fire of 1914. And next photo, please. And then just on the other side of the train station, behind the train station, was another mill that was built in 1892 by Edward Molesworth. It was a planing mill, a lumber mill, and it actually sat diagonally. And there was a single line of track. You could see it on the early maps that are in the book of 1899 to service this mill. And I'll talk about some of the projects later that changed that landscape of the mill and the railroad sidings behind the train station. But this mill later became known as the Mount Airy Lumber and Grain when Charles Runkles went into business with Edward Molesworth. And then by 1921, it became the Marion Runkles Flour Mill, and that unfortunately was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1925 and never rebuilt. Next slide, please. So Mount Airy in the Civil War, this is an early map of Mount Airy. One of the features here is the actual location of the train station, which is not on the eastern side of the Mount Airy Road where it now sits. It's on the other side where Henry Buzzard's Tavern sits. In fact, from Henry Buzzard's ledger, and what we now have good evidence for is that Henry Buzzard's Tavern and General Store served as the railroad station for many, many years. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Next slide, please. So there were many characters. This is a chapter on the Civil War in Mount Airy. We have a lot of great history of Mount Airy in the Civil War. I will not get into a lot of it now with just a couple of excerpts. But this is a photograph of Billy Dorsey. He was a Confederate rebel on the right. And I write here, during the Civil War, Mount Airy sat within a 50-mile radius of 6 major battlefields, and there were many incursions by Confederate forces into town for the purpose of sabotage, road blockades, and pickets in the area. Because Maryland had so many Southern sympathizers, the railroads, highways, canals, towns, and cities of Maryland were frequently raided by Confederate cavalry and infantry and by guerrilla fighters. Many Mount Airy locals fought on both sides of the Civil War, one of whom was Henry Buzzard's grandson, William Billy Henry Buzzard Dorsey. He was born on August 23, 1841, as the son of Gustavus Dorsey and his wife, Sophia. During the Civil War, he became a Confederate cavalryman. He was captain of Company D, 1st Maryland Cavalry, CSA. He served under Colonel Ridgely Brown. During the war, he received several wounds, including one in the breast and other parts of his body, from at which times he suffered greatly. And Dorsey survived. I think he died at the age of 38 in 1879 after the war. Some excerpts that we found from Civil War records. Dorsey was a menace in the area. In May 6, 1861, Union Brigadier General Benjamin Butler wrote a letter to Lieutenant General Scott in Annapolis complaining of Dorsey's hostilities. His letter reads in part, 2 companies of cavalry along responded to the call from this vicinity. They were commanded by Captain William H.B. Dorsey and Captain George H. Gaither, both violent rebels who have more than once put themselves in a hostile attitude to the United States government. They have conducted themselves with great violence and in fact are now in arms against the Union, although nominally holding commissions from the governor of Maryland. Cannot anything be done with them? Might they not be arrested and at least restrained until we are certain what will be the disposition of Maryland? And lo and behold, Dorsey had many exploits too, which were to raid his own hometown. He was part and parcel of Jeb Stuart's cavalry raids twice in 1862 and then July of 1863 when they raided Mount Airy Station. It's recorded in the newspapers. We also have some Mount Airy history with some detail about some of his exploits. In the 1863 raid, Dorsey and some men compelled John Hipsley and other workers on the railroad to tear up the tracks, and they threw them down the steep embankments in Mount Airy. And that area of Mount Airy is now the brand new walking trail on the western side of Mount Airy. If you get to Mount Airy, go to Hill Street. That is the start of the brand new western walking trail that goes down the old main line. And you could see the rugged embankments that Mount Airy sat on. That's where the Confederate raiders raided Mount Airy and threw those tracks down the cliff. And during that raid, I just wanted to say that Dorsey apparently ran into some farmers that were herding cattle in the morning on their way to Mount Airy. And he and his other rebels made him turn around and drove that head of cattle all the way to Boonesboro in a single day to feed the rebel troops on the other side of the line. Next slide, please. So this is the Mount Airy Station. So in fact, despite the promise to build a depot at the summit, there's really no evidence that we had that the B&O in fact built a train station. In fact, all the evidence points that Mount Airy, that Henry Buzzard's Tavern served as the train station. In his ledger, we have volumes of reports where he's charging people for tonnage to go to Hood's Mills, round-trip tickets, all these sorts of things. The first station that we do know was this little clapboard passenger house that was built after the Civil War in 1869. And then the station was expanded. In 1876, the brick freight house was built, which was actually a small portion of the station today. It encompassed 2 freight doors. It was made out of brick, and then in 1882, they extended it by 20 feet on the eastern side. If you come to the Mount Airy Museum, we have a great model of early Mount Airy from around 1870 through 1915, and the station is modeled there as it looked in 1882. And then finally, it wasn't until 1905 that the station was finally renovated, again by another Confederate general, Victor Bauman, General Victor Bauman, and he was an officer on the B&O Railroad who got it into mind to basically renovate the station by 1905, and that's the photo of it being renovated. Interestingly, they tore down the wooden passenger house, but if you look carefully at the photo to the right of them putting up the brick passenger house, just behind it, you could see the wooden passenger house still exists, which means they moved it physically. For what purpose, I'm not sure. Maybe to serve passengers for that few months while they were building the brick freight house. But you could see they physically picked up this wooden clapboard shack and moved it backwards. So next slide, please. So I have a chapter on the 1870s. The 1870s in America was a difficult time. It was very hard times. There was a worldwide depression. Men in the county, Carroll County, Montgomery County, were often out of work. Mount Airy sat at the transportation hubs of all of these railroads and roads. And so according to all the newspapers and accounts at the time, tramps would come through town causing lots of problem. So I'd like to read, although the decade looked promising, there was trouble ahead. In 1873, a financial crisis occurred in the United States, which lasted until 1879 and caused a depression throughout the decade and many years afterwards. There are many economic causes for the crisis, including a stock market crash and speculative investments by the railroads. Cutting costs, terminating jobs, and other extreme measures taken by the B&O Railroad caused labor riots and panic towards the end of the decade. These years were hard for many men out of work, but public sentiment was not empathetic to tramps in the Maryland countryside wreaking havoc close to Mount Airy. One Westminster newspaper reported, "A disposition is abroad to show tramps no quarter. Their murders, arsons, robberies, thefts, drunkenness, and disorderly conduct generally have arrayed all persons against them. In some places they are traveling in bands and committed such depredations that the people are forming themselves into organizations for protection. The tramps have become so organized. They don't intend to work, but would sooner beg or steal and seem resolved to force society to give them subsistence, or they will apply the torch to barns and dwellings if their insolent demands are denied." And then I write, in later years, tramps were responsible for torching the homes of Raymond Barnes and Joseph Spurrier in Mount Airy, as well as for shooting a B&O brakeman in Mount Airy. Tramps along the lines would often try to derail trains nearby with the hopes of stealing goods and valuables from the wreckage. And then from there, we cover a lot of this type of troubled times in Mount Airy during the 1870s. I think I have early description in 1870. So in the early 1870s, Mount Airy was still just a small whistle stop. Early residents Charles Buzzard and Samuel Clay both described Mount Airy in these early years. Buzzard recalled, quote, 6 houses and the railroad station were considered the heart of the town. One of the oldest houses was a brick structure owned by Henry Buzzard. Bill Dorsey kept a feed store where the Mount Airy Mill down does business. Clay later described Mount Airy as it looked around 1876, stating that, quote, a dirt road bordered on one side by dense woods and on the other side by a sage field led from Mount Airy to Ridgeville, contained only about 5 houses. There was the old John Runkle's property still standing across the street from the First National Bank and the Henry Buzzard residence directly to the rear of the present post office. 3 other structures, since torn down, were a dwelling below the railroad station, then owned by John Hipsley, an Anderson store, and situated where the mill now stands, and a harness shop located on the present site of the commercial bank. Next slide, please. So this is a photograph of Byron Dorsey. Byron Dorsey was the younger son of Confederate rebel Billy Dorsey. He was a grandson of Henry Buzzard. He was born in the 1850s, and he was actually Mount Airy's first mayor in 1894, when Mount Airy became incorporated. He was a businessman, first and foremost. He was owner of the Mount Airy mill property that we just talked about. He also ran an agricultural store. There's evidence that he and his brother Billy, before Billy died, operated a feed store together as well. Byron Dorsey was also called up in the railroad riots of 1877. At the time, many historians here, you're probably aware, one of the worst B&O riots happened in summer of 1877 when they cut costs and fired a number of people, and the town of Baltimore really erupted. Thousands of people came out to protest. They battled with police. There were dozens of murders up and down the line between Baltimore and Frederick, and the governor of Maryland called for the posse comitatus to come to the rescue. And Byron Dorsey basically rode to Westminster with a bunch of others, collected 50 men, and then rode back to Mount Airy, and then patrolled up and down the lines to protect the railroad just for a few days before the riots ended. And just days after those riots ended, in fact, there was a shooting right there at the Mount Airy station in July of 1877 when 3 men were ambushed by unknown assailants. And that was supposedly 2 days after the riots ended, but still you could see how violence occurred up and down the line. So I'm mindful of time. We could go to the next slide. I thought I'd just give everybody a picture tour here of early Mount Airy. Some of these photos are familiar. Here we are looking south on Main Street. We're standing on the railroad station. This is Mount Airy around 1900, before the Great Fire of 1903. Immediately to the right, off camera, you could barely see the clip of the porch, stood William Hood's General Store, built in 1885. The dock right next to it, to the right, that has the feed bags and the dock and the horses standing in front of it, that is the outbuilding to Hood's General Store. In fact, it was this building that most likely saved Hood's store from burning down in the Great Fire of 1903, because this caught fire, but they were able to put out the fire before the fire burned Hood's store. The next building, just behind the wagon, that is Lorenzo B. Norwood's home and confectionery store. He was a candy maker as well as a shop maker. The next building down is Walter Rudy's Pharmacy. Rudy was from Middletown, a famous businessman, real estate agent. He was in it all. He manufactured his own drugs. He ran an automobile dealership. He was quite a character in town. But this was his early general store before the fire. The little white building just after that, that is Byron Dorsey's feed and implement store. And then the big building just beyond it is the J.C. Gilbert Hotel and Saloon. Rudy actually built that building. He built it to be a residence, but he quickly moved out of that and then leased it to be a hotel and saloon. And that was a famous hangout for a lot of the railroad workers during all of the construction in the 1900s. In fact, lots of shootouts occurred at that hotel. Next slide, please. So here we are, we're standing on top of the Flatiron building, we're looking left. The immediate building to the left is the Raymond Barnes business, but it was Raymond Barnes' personal residence, it was Raymond Barnes' furniture business, and Mary McWilliams ran a millinery, a hat factory in there. The little dual 2-story brick building just beyond that is the Mary Byers residence. She was a dressmaker, and that was a dwelling house. And then just beyond that, again to the left, is the J.C. Gilbert Hotel and Saloon. In the early days of Mount Airy, prior to the fire of 1903, there was really nothing on the right side, the east side of Main Street. That was all horse and buggy parking. And in fact, if you think traffic is bad in today's Mount Airy, you should have heard them complain in the early newspapers about the lack of horse hitches and places to park buggies back in the day. So I have no sympathy for Mount Airy's burning. Next slide, please. So traveling south down Main Street, it's now a residential quarter, but many people might not know this is a beautiful photo. This was the Mountain View Hotel built by Ernest B. Horn. Horn was originally a resident of Baltimore, if I remember correctly. He suffered from malaria, and he and his family moved to Mount Airy because of the breezy winds, the good climate, and he became a pretty prominent landowner. He bought up a lot of land, and in 1892, he built this hotel. This is our only photo that we have of it. And not surprising, it burned down. Mount Airy, everybody's familiar with the history of Mount Airy's fires. Suffice to say, in the last century alone, Mount Airy suffered from no less than 30 significant fires. 4 major fires, which nearly destroyed the town altogether, which were the Great Fire of 1898, the next fire of 1903, which took out all of South Main Street, then the fire of 1914, which took out the western side of Northern Business District, and then the fire of 1925, which did a lot of damage. But the hotel caught fire on New Year's Eve of 1895 and burned down. And just across from this hotel sat on 26 acres of land that Ernest Horn purchased. Just across from the hotel was the early Pine Grove Chapel. If you haven't seen this photo, this is Pine Grove in 1907 before it was restored. There was a big restoration project in 1934, and that is the chapel that we all know and love today. But this is how it looked in the early days. And next photo, please. Here I just wanted to point out, this was the location of the Mount Airy Methodist Episcopal Church. This is now Calvary Church on Main Street. This was the location of Calvary Church. But this church was built in 1890s, and Calvary was built in 1916. But it's located at the same place. And then just across from the church is the view of the residential section. In Mount Airy's residential section, all this really started to develop after the Henry Buzzard estate was sold in 1884. Henry Buzzard died in 1881. His son Milton held a big estate auction. We have from early accounts on that auction, newspaper reports, a lot of great detail in the book about who lived where and who bought what and who was doing what before they bought the property. So it's just great stuff. But this is what the residence looks like in Mount Airy. Okay, so right around the turn of the century, this is really when the trouble started in Mount Airy, between the years 1899 and 1903. And the reason was, again, the B&O Railroad was all about the grade. So now it wasn't enough to do the old main line through Mount Airy. They wanted to build a tunnel underneath the town of Ridgeville. If you're not familiar, the current CSX tunnel is the tunnel that they built in the year 1900. And it goes underneath part of the town of Ridgeville. Every resident in Mount Airy could hear the train whistles blow late at night. That is the train going through the tunnel. But there were many other projects at the time. So one of the projects in 1899 was coming through the cut in the ridge. The B&O wanted to shave off part of Parr's Ridge right behind Edward Molesworth's planing mill, and they wanted to put 2 track sidings there. So they basically shaved off the ridge, they laid these sidings, and then they physically lifted up and built a new foundation of the mill, and they moved that mill onto its current foundation. And that foundation is what exists today in that back parking lot of the Mount Airy Museum. It's where the bike shop is, and those sheds and the snow cone shack exist today. But that work was done in 1899. They also wanted to dig a tunnel, if you could believe it, underneath Main Street, where the 4 railroad tracks ran right across Main Street. And the idea was for pedestrians and wagons, so they wouldn't have to go over these tracks. which were very dangerous in town. They wanted to make them go under and dump out onto Prospect Avenue, but that project never came to pass. And then in addition, they were building the new mainline tunnel just a mile down the road beneath the town of Ridgeville. And they also built many other projects. You could go to the next slide. The Twin Arch, which everybody is familiar with in Mount Airy. That was a major project as they were re-diverting the main line instead of through Mount Airy. It now went around Mount Airy. And the challenging aspect to this in Mount Airy's early days was to do these projects, primarily building the tunnel. The railroad hired contractors out of Philadelphia, a company called D.H. Clement and Company. And all of these workers converged in a window of time of 3 years, thousands of workers from all over the world and across the United States onto the streets of Little Mount Airy. The railroad encampments were in Ridgeville, they were in Monrovia, but the train station was in Mount Airy, and all the projects were surrounding Mount Airy. So at any given time, were hundreds of railroad workers patrolling up and down Main Street. And of course, during that window of time were just hard times for Mount Airy. There were shootouts at the train station, murders on Main Street. The railroad workers would often spend their money. There was lawlessness, there was drunkenness. It was a real challenge. And in addition to that, in the year 1900, there was actually a gang of outlaws patrolling South Main Street between Ridgeville and Mount Airy that were responsible for holdups, not just of the workers, but of the town of Mount Airy residents themselves. In addition to that, there was a gang of gypsies that were responsible for house break-ins and pickpockets and minor thefts. In fact, Little Mount Airy telegraphed to Frederick County to ask if something couldn't be done to establish a temporary police force in Mount Airy, at least until all the railroad work was done. But it was a real challenge. And then in digging the tunnel, there were many, many challenges. The tunnel collapsed in April of 1901 on the western side. And this happened when all these workers were trying to blast a shaft using dynamite, and an accident occurred and 2,000 tons of earth caved in, killing and injuring a number of those workers. And then just a few months later on the eastern side of the tunnel, another collapse caved in, burying a number of workers alive. Some of those workers, we believe, are buried at St. Michael's Cemetery. And if you think that's bad, right in the middle of all this drama, there was a brazen murder on Main Street when a railroad boss, a guy by the name of George Riley, killed a favorite worker, a guy by the name of Jack Ryan. He had a grudge against him and tracked him down into one of the local blacksmith shops right there on Main Street. And a fight ensued, and basically he was beaten to death. Riley beat Jack Ryan to death with the butt of his gun and then escaped to Philadelphia before he was captured and brought back to trial. And all of that, the brazen murder of a favorite son, the dangerous working conditions of the railroad, caused the railroad workers in the fall of 1901 to erupt in a riot. In fact, one of the worst riots in B&O Railroad history, right there on the main streets of Mount Airy. And the workers patrolled up and down Main Street. They beat people with clubs. They stabbed people with knives. One man was shot. Mount Airy telegraphed for the posse to come in. It took 2 days to quell this riot on the main streets of Mount Airy.
Well, Mr. Valett, this has been fabulous.
Thank you so much.
History, and you will be able to answer more questions and sign books, correct?
Yes, books are right in the back. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Books are for sale, cash or check, written to the Historical Society of Mount Airy for $40.
Well, let's give Mr. Valett a huge round of applause.
Thank you.